In the year 1252, a new chapter began for the Kingdom of Denmark, though it was one steeped in the blood of recent memory. Christopher I ascended to the throne, not through glorious conquest, but following the untimely death of his brother, King Abel. The realm he inherited was a fractured one, still reeling from the fratricidal conflicts that had defined the preceding reigns. Christopher was known to be a man of firm resolve, a necessary trait for a king in such turbulent times. He was the son of Valdemar II, the victorious, and the shadow of his father's powerful reign loomed large. Yet, a new power was consolidating its influence across Europe, one that did not answer to kings or crowns. This was the era of the Church militant, a period where the papacy sought to assert its authority over the temporal rulers of Christendom. In Denmark, the embodiment of this ecclesiastical ambition was a man named Jacob Erlandsen, the Archbishop of Lund. Erlandsen was a formidable figure, a scholar and a canon lawyer of international repute. He was a man who believed, with every fiber of his being, in the supremacy of God's law over the laws of men. To him, the Church was an independent kingdom, and its servants were immune from the meddling of secular lords. The collision between these two unyielding men, King Christopher and Archbishop Erlandsen, was not just likely, it was inevitable. The initial spark of the conflict was, as is often the case, a matter of money. Christopher, seeking to consolidate his power and stabilize the kingdom's finances, needed to raise new taxes. He looked upon the vast, wealthy lands held by the Church and saw a resource that was not contributing its fair share. The king decreed that the Church, like all other landowners in his realm, must pay taxes to the crown. Archbishop Erlandsen's response was immediate and absolute. He flatly refused the king's demand, citing ancient privileges and divine right. The Church's wealth, he argued, belonged to God and could not be taxed by a mortal king. This was not merely a financial dispute, it was a fundamental challenge to Christopher's authority as sovereign. Erlandsen did not stop at refusal. He went on the offensive. He issued his own edict, forbidding any peasant or tenant living on church lands from answering the king's call to arms. This struck at the very heart of the feudal system and the king's ability to raise an army. The archbishop was effectively creating a state within a state, a domain where his word, not the king's, was law. Furthermore, Erlandsen began working to align Danish ecclesiastical law with the broader canon law of Rome. This move was designed to systematically dismantle the traditional influence the Danish crown held over the Church in its own lands. Christopher saw this for what it was, a power grab of monumental proportions. The tension between the two factions grew, poisoning the political atmosphere of the entire kingdom. In 1256, the archbishop made his most audacious move yet. A council in the town of Vejle, Erlandsen and his bishops promulgated a new constitution. This document, which became known as the Vejle Constitution, was a direct threat to the king. It declared that if any bishop in Denmark were to be arrested or harmed by the royal power, the entire country would be placed under interdict. An interdict was a spiritual weapon of immense power, a collective punishment that would deny the sacraments to the entire population. No masses would be held, no confessions heard, no Christian burials granted. The gates of heaven, in effect, would be closed to the people of Denmark. Erlandsen had drawn a line in the sand, daring the king to cross it. Christopher, for his part, was enraged by this open act of rebellion. He viewed the Vejle Constitution as treason, a direct assault on the sovereignty of the Danish crown. The final breaking point came a year later. In 1257, over the matter of the royal succession. Christopher, like any prudent monarch, sought to secure the future of his dynasty, demanded that the leading men of the kingdom, including the bishops, recognize his young son, Eric, as the rightful heir to the throne. This was a standard procedure, a way to ensure a smooth transition of power and avoid future civil wars. But Archbishop Erlandsson refused. He would not swear fealty to the boy, nor would he allow the other bishops to anoint him as the future king. He declared that any bishop who dared to participate in such a coronation would be immediately excommunicated. This was a direct and personal attack on the king and his lineage. By denying the succession, Erlandsson was not just challenging Christopher's authority, he was threatening to plunge the kingdom back into the chaos of a succession crisis. For King Christopher, this was the ultimate act of defiance, an act he could not ignore. His patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. King decided that the time for negotiation was over. He issued a royal warrant for the arrest of Archbishop Jacob Erlandsson. The king's soldiers rode to Lund, the seat of the archbishop's power. They stormed the archbishop's residence, taking him completely by surprise. Jacob Erlandsson, the most powerful cleric in Denmark, was taken into custody. But Christopher was not content with merely imprisoning his rival. He sought to humiliate him, to break his spirit and show the world the price of defying the king. The archbishop was stripped of his sacred vestments. He was forced to wear the clothes of a common layman, a deliberate act of degradation. To complete the humiliation, a fool's cap, with bells on it, was placed upon his head. He was then paraded through the streets, a spectacle for the common people to witness. The man who claimed to be above all secular authority was now a prisoner, a fool in the king's court. Christopher had crossed the line that Erlandsson had drawn at Vejle. The church's response was swift and automatic, just as the Constitution had promised. The interdict fell upon Denmark like a suffocating shroud. Church bells fell silent across the kingdom. The doors of the churches were barred and locked. Priests refused to perform the sacraments, turning away the faithful. Weddings could not be sanctified. The dying could not receive their last rites. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground, like animals, without the prayers of the church. For the deeply religious people of the 13th century, this was a terrifying prospect. Their very salvation, and the salvation of their loved ones, seemed to be in jeopardy. The kingdom was thrown into turmoil. Many nobles, fearing for their souls and angered by the king's high-handedness, began to turn against Christopher. The king, however, remained defiant, keeping the archbishop locked away in a fortress. The country was paralyzed, caught in the grip of this titanic struggle between the temporal and spiritual powers. The standoff seemed to have no end in sight. Then, in May of 1259, the unexpected happened. King Christopher was in the town of Rhyme, in southern Jutland. He attended Mass and took Holy Communion. Shortly after, he was taken violently ill. Within hours, King Christopher was dead. His death was so sudden and convenient for his enemies that rumors began to fly immediately. The official cause was not recorded, but many believed it was not a natural death. The finger of blame was pointed at one man in particular, Abbot Arnfast of Ride Abbey. Arnfast was a known ally of the imprisoned archbishop. The story that spread like wildfire was that the abbot had poisoned the communion wine or the host itself. It was said to be an act of vengeance for the king's persecution of the church and the humiliation of Archbishop Erlandsson. Whether true or not, the tale of the poisoned king became a potent legend. Christopher's sudden death immediately changed the political landscape. With the king gone, his formidable will was no longer a factor. The new ruler was his son, Eric I, who was still just a boy. Real power fell to the boy's mother, the Queen Dowager, Margrethe Sambiria Tonkt. Margrethe was a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, known as Margaret Springhest or Burst Horse. She understood that the kingdom could not survive while the interdict was in place. One of her first acts as regent was to seek a reconciliation with the church. She ordered the release of Archbishop Jacob Erlandsen from his long imprisonment. The archbishop, though weakened, was unbowed. His release ended the immediate crisis and led to the lifting of the interdict. Church doors were reopened, and the sounds of prayer and song once again filled the air. However, the underlying conflict between the crown and the church was far from resolved. Erlandsen continued to fight for the church's privileges for the rest of his life. The struggle would continue to plague the reign of Eric V and his successors for decades to come. The ghost of the conflict between Christopher I and Jacob Erlandsen would haunt Danish politics for generations. It was a defining struggle of medieval Denmark, a clash of two powerful ideologies. It highlighted the deep-seated tension between the desire for a strong, centralized monarchy and the universalist claims of the papacy. Christopher I went down in history as the church-fighting king, a monarch who dared to challenge the immense power of the medieval church. His reign, though short and fraught with conflict, was a critical moment in the long and complex story of Denmark's journey toward a modern state. The king's defiance, though it led to his own demise, set a precedent for future monarchs. He had shown that a secular ruler could, in fact, imprison an archbishop, a shocking act at the time. Archbishop's use of the interdict demonstrated the church's most powerful spiritual weapon in action. The conflict drew in other regional powers, with neighboring kingdoms watching the instability in Denmark with great interest. Christopher had also attempted to have his brother, the former King Abel, canonized as a saint to counter the church's influence. This political move was ultimately unsuccessful, blocked by the very clerical power he sought to undermine. The financial strain of the conflict was immense, weakening the kingdom from within. Peasants and common folk were the primary victims, caught between their king's laws and their church's spiritual threats. The division among the Danish nobility was a wound that would take many years to heal. Margrethe Sambiria's regency was marked by her skillful navigation of these treacherous political waters. She managed to preserve the crown for her son, Eric, against incredible odds. Jacob Erlandsen, upon his release, traveled to Rome to plead his case directly before the Pope. The legal battles continued in the papal court for years, a testament to the complexity of the issues. Erlandsen would die in 1274 on the island of Rügen, still technically in exile, never fully regaining his former power in Denmark. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of the conflict he had championed. The principles he fought for, clerical immunity and church independence, remain central points of contention. Christopher's legacy is thus a dual one, a king who fought for royal authority but also plunged his kingdom into chaos. The story serves as a powerful example of the classic medieval power struggle between church and state. The king's attempt to tax the church was a move seen in many kingdoms across Europe during this period. However, the ferocity of the Danish conflict was notable. The personal animosity between Christopher and Jacob Erlandsen fueled the flames of the dispute. Neither man was willing to compromise on his fundamental principles. The humiliation of the archbishop was a calculated risk by Christopher, one that ultimately backfired. It galvanized the opposition and gave them a martyr-like figure to rally around. The suspicion of poison surrounding the king's death served as a dark warning to future rulers. It suggested that the church was not without its own temporal and deadly weapons. The interdict left deep psychological scars on the Danish population. Generations would remember the time when the churches were closed and salvation seemed out of reach. The conflict also had significant economic consequences, disrupting trade and agriculture. The king's war with the church was a distraction from other pressing state matters, such as defending the borders. Ultimately, the fight demonstrated that neither side could achieve a total victory. The Danish monarchy and the church were locked in a symbiotic, if often antagonistic, relationship. A balance of power, not absolute dominance, was the only viable path forward. The reign of Christopher I, the church-fighting king, remains a stark and compelling lesson in the perennial struggle for power. His actions, born of a desire to strengthen his kingdom, nearly led to its complete unraveling. The archbishop's zeal, born of faith, inflicted profound suffering on the very flock he was sworn to protect. The echoes of their battle shaped the legal and political framework of Denmark for centuries. It was a brutal, foundational conflict that forged a new understanding of kingship and faith in the north.